Realm presents Remade, Season 1, Episode 9.
Janeway would know what to do, but she was dead. Well, May thought, probably she'd be dead soon too. That would solve basically all of her problems in one elegant step. She wasn't sure what it was doing outside exactly. Snow? Hail? Chunks of frozen water were falling from the sky in various sizes and textures. It was like the heavens couldn't make up their minds, and were trying a sampler platter of everything imaginable. May shivered, alone, under her paltry glass shelter. The red jumpsuits the caretakers had given them had been all too warm in the tropics, but they hadn't been designed for anything like this blizzard. Gusts cut through the fabric, tearing away any warmth she generated, and leaving her covered in goose flesh. May was so cold that straightening her arms was painful. The tendons were frozen tight. Her ears were burning, and even tucked into her sleeves, her stiff hands ached. Electricity arced from one cloud to another. Thunder boomed overhead. May felt very, very small, and very, very alone. The others weren't so far away, really. Maybe a mile at most. But they might as well have been on the moon, or back in her parents' dining room, enjoying some board games and her dad's signature dumplings. The thought reminded her, again, that she was hungry. Her new normal. There had at least been plenty of food on the train. Against her better judgment, May had given in to sheer animal desire, and eaten enough that she'd felt sick. At first, she thought it was her old, dear friend anaphylaxis, but then she'd realized it was simple gluttony. The train felt like a long time ago, though, and a now familiar hunger was settling into her bones again. She wondered if the other survivors had been caught out in this weather too, or if they had found something in the way of shelter from this storm. Maybe gone back to huddle in the wreck of the train. Maybe they'd all die of hypothermia, every last one of them. That would be a cosmic joke, and not a funny one. Dead, or almost dead, then brought here for unknown reasons, to suffer just a little while longer, and then die all over again. Pointless cruelty. She wondered, for the millionth time, why this had happened to her, specifically. She'd searched and searched for a common thread, but they'd all lived in different places, liked different things. They had different genes, different philosophies, different skills. The only thing they had in common was dying at the right time. Or, come to think of it, at exactly the wrong time. Sometimes May thought they still had a chance of going home again. Whatever had happened to bring them here, surely it could be reversed. But right now, she thought they'd all have been better off staying dead. At any rate, here she was, crouched under a glass table, one in a vast plantation of identical glass tables, while the snow piled up faster than she would have thought possible. It couldn't have been snowing for more than 15 minutes, 20 at the most, but it was already ankle deep. The surface was churned up from the wind, marked with craters where larger chunks of ice had fallen from time to time. May didn't have a lot of experience with how snow worked, but none of this struck her as particularly normal, even with climate change turning normal into a moving target. The pieces of hail grew bigger, clattering against her shelter like 1,000 would-be Romeos throwing pebbles for her attention. Hail as big as apricots. She saw one or two the size of oranges. She hoped the shelter wouldn't shatter and leave her exposed. What would she do if it did? She needed a plan. Hide under the next one and hope that it wouldn't break too. There were plenty of the glass sheets, a whole farm of them. Surely some of them would survive intact. Of course, by staying where she was, she might be risking injury from the glass shards if hail did destroy her cover. Should she just make a break for the trees? She didn't know how much shelter the boughs would give her, really. And there was the question of lightning, too. She was probably safer from the lightning here. She eyed the trees, trying to work out which would be most likely to get struck by lightning. Instead of lightning, one leafy giant was overcome by the weight of ice on its shoulders, and cracked in a spiral along its trunk. Its crown crashed to the ground. She couldn't hear it fall. The wind was howling too hard. She would stay, she decided, until she had to make another decision. And hopefully the storm would blow over soon. And then she realized with a sudden jolt that Gabe was still out there all alone in the woods. She'd left him behind without a second thought. Had he found shelter too? Was he safe and warm? Should she go looking for him? Chunks of ice struck above her, bounced away. A movement drew her eye back toward the distant trees. A flash of red against the white. A flash of brown. It was Gabe. Shuffling toward her through the drifts of whatever this was falling from the sky. He hunched over against the wind and the cold, one arm crossed tight around his ribs, his hand tucked into his armpit. The other held the walking stick she'd made for him. He leaned on it like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Gabe shouted into the wind, but May couldn't hear him. It wasn't too hard to guess what he'd be saying, though. "May? May, where are you?" Then he stumbled in the snow on his good leg and landed hard on the bad one. May winced for him. She called back to him. "Over here! Gabe, I'm here!" She didn't think he'd be able to hear her over the wind and the rattling pellets of hail on the glass, but his head turned and he looked right at her. He looked afraid. And then, as May watched, a huge chunk of ice fell from the sky and bounced off Gabe's skull. His eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the ground, a coat falling off its hanger. May cried out despite herself, stuffing her knuckles into her mouth. He wasn't so far away, really. Just a few dozen yards. She could still clearly see the splash of red of his jumpsuit, stark against the snow. And another spreading flare of red from the blood seeping from his head into the snow. The snow shifted and shrank where the blood touched, still warm from his veins. There were no ambulances here, much less hospitals, stitches, MRI machines. She was suddenly, vividly aware that Gabe could be dead or dying. Blood loss maybe, or shock. Concussion and brain swelling, hypothermia, frostbite, gangrene, infection, and sepsis. So many ways to die, and nothing she could do about any of them. The only question was which one would take him first. May was starting to think she was as good as dead, too. She couldn't last against the cold for much longer if she stayed put with no fire, no blankets, nothing. And if she tried to make a run for it, the same thing that had just happened to Gabe would happen to her. 2 more deaths would add to the pile of corpses they'd already left behind. But this time was worse. This time, May knew with complete and flawless certainty that it was all her own fault. "24 hours earlier." May stared at the barkless stick in her hand, then marked another notch on it. The simple act summoned ghosts, or more precisely, a haunting memory of the lost. "We should keep track of time," Wesley had said. "It'll help to keep us from going bonkers." He and Hiram had kept careful watch of the stars and sun those first few days, debating endlessly about their observations and what they meant. May wasn't quite sure how they'd reached any conclusions. Something to do with angles and north. The boys had agreed on one thing. Despite the oppressive heat and humidity, it was late fall, wherever and whenever they were. Slowly, they'd settled on a date and begun marking time, notch by notch. Nobody could agree on a year, though. Wesley had insisted it was the future, but Hiram, their next best thing to an expert, wouldn't back up Wesley's conclusions. Hiram steadfastly insisted they were in spirit prison, which sounded like some kind of Mormon purgatory. The rest of the group had no hope of reaching a consensus on what had happened to them, what would happen, and what could be done about it. Arguments sparked and burned hot over the question. Theories were launched and just as quickly abandoned. To be fair, even Wesley kept changing his mind about exactly how much future he was talking about. Jingwei had agreed with Wesley's conclusions, but didn't see any point in fighting it out. "Let them be wrong," she'd said, shrugging. Eventually, the group had settled into an unspoken treaty to not bring it up. But not before May had been persuaded by Wesley's case. The stars were the same, the plants and animals close enough to familiar. This place smelled like Earth. An Earth with space elevators and satellites, with ruined skyscrapers and a language she'd never spoken. An Earth where all the people were gone. An Earth where Jingwei and Wesley were gone now, too. May ran a finger along the stick, feeling the marks that Wesley had carved. There was a cold, hard place inside of her. A place that didn't feel any of this, because she had to keep moving. There was work to do. But even that cold, hard place twinged at the thought of Wesley and his awful, well-meaning jokes. Unwelcome memories continued to haunt May. Once they'd established a rhythm to life at the old base camp, Hiram had done a Sunday church service as best he could, reciting bits of Bible verse from memory to himself. A few of the others had joined in. Cole recited a few psalms, and Saya, it turned out, had a crystalline and perfect rendition of Ave Maria that left the camp awed into reverent silence. Hey, religion had seemed to make them feel better. May wished she had something half so effective in her own toolbox. She could use a mood boost as much as anyone else. She shoved all of that away. No point wallowing in sorrow. The future, May. Look forward, not back. So, the calendar. Fall was turning toward winter, and May marked off the day dutifully. None of the passing dates had meant much of anything to May until now, but tomorrow would be December 5th, the day she was supposed to be sitting for the SAT. It was a day when all her hard work and all her long-range plans were meant to start coming together. First, a high score. Top of her class, she'd been sure of it. She'd even beat out Mason, no matter what it took to do it. And that was the key that was supposed to open the door to her bright, historic future. Every day that passed in this wasteland was another day further away from everything she'd ever wanted and worked for. No first Chinese-American Supreme Court justice, no Stanford Law, or Harvard, or Yale. At this point, she had serious reservations about whether she could even finish high school in a timely fashion, much less earn admission to the college of her choice. Even if they could find another time travel device, or whatever had brought them here, even if it was possible to somehow be transported safely back home to the moment after she ate that fatal granola bar, she'd already spent too much time off her game. She couldn't remember any of her talking points from Model UN. She couldn't remember what unit they'd been starting in math. She was pretty sure she'd lost about half the French she'd ever known. May tried to conjugate the French verb for to look after. She couldn't remember the word at all. If she returned home now, like this, she'd be on track for some crummy community college. Maybe, at best, life as a paralegal. She felt sick at the idea. May Sicko was supposed to change things. Fix them. But that was slipping out of reach, day by day. No matter whether she was stuck here forever, or still found a way home. How do you fix an empty world? And how do you fix anything with an empty head? A sharp voice caught her attention and pulled her out of her reverie. Holden, you're not the only one who's been through a lot, okay? Other people matter too. Ah, it was Sunita, lashing out any way she could, just like that tiger she'd helped to bring down. Looked like the rest of their sad little band of survivors was arguing about what to do and where to go. Again. Who said you don't matter? I think you do matter, and that's why we can't stay here. Holden paced, rubbing his temples. I don't have to remind you how much danger we're in, do I? Was it just yesterday the train had wrecked? Only one jumpy, sleepless night since their last brush with death. The arguing felt like it had gone on for a month already. Maybe 2. After everyone had escaped the runaway train, Inez and Teddy had led most of the survivors in search of a well-camouflaged resting place, while Loki, Holden, and Umta stayed behind to forage. The scavengers had eventually come to the new camp, dragging a couple of sheets of twisted metal, loaded down with gruel and water tanks pulled from the train. That's when the arguing had started. Inez had chosen their new camp just deep enough into the forest to be out of sight from the rails, but it wasn't far enough for Holden. He kept warning anyone who would listen, and everyone who wouldn't, that they had to get farther away. Keep running. Not everyone was interested in fighting or fleeing. There were other things to worry about besides caretakers. For example, as far as they knew, the gruel could spoil in the next day without power. So Nevaeh had taken control of the situation and was doling out equal portions with a mercilessly fair hand. Hiram had started the fire this time, and May had boundless gratitude for the scoutmaster who taught him how. For today, at least, they had gotten well ahead of the basic survival game. Too bad it wouldn't last. Now the survivors huddled around the campfire in the fading day, sitting in the bare dirt, because really, what did it matter anymore? None of them were clean in the first place. Weeks from the last shower. Weeks from the last time they'd so much as smelled a bar of soap. At least they were becoming used to their respective aromas through constant exposure. The growing out haircuts and fledgling beards, though, were taking a little more time to get used to. May was jammed in between Gabe and Teddy, which meant she felt a lot smaller and more overlooked than she usually did, even for here. She wasn't loud, not really, but back home people had listened to her. She missed that. Holden carried on with his latest rant in progress. Though he'd been right, hadn't he? About the caretakers and the danger they'd been in. If they'd only believed him from the start, how many more would be sitting beside them now? Maybe annoying, maybe arguing, but at least they'd be alive. May shifted uncomfortably. Gabe glanced at her, his eyebrows asking silently if she was okay. She nodded and looked away. We've all seen what the caretakers can do. We can't stay this close to the tracks. Holden pointed in the general direction of the wreck for emphasis. The caretakers know we got on that train, and they're going to follow us here. We need to leave while we still can. Umta bobbed her whole body up and down by way of a nod. We should run. And where exactly do you think we should go, hotshot? Loki spat at Holden. He had reached a rolling simmer. I'm not sure there's anywhere safe for us to run to. Reckon we wouldn't be in this mess if you hadn't gone shooting from the hip like that, Cole muttered. His leg was stretched painfully out in front of him, the splint filthy but still holding together. Loki lifted his chin. Say it to my face. He saved our lives. Sunita half stood. That caretaker on the train could have... Stop it. Stop right now. Look around. Holden stood up and waved in a broad circle. We can't afford to fight like this. You all saw the terrain outside of those train windows the same as I did. There's nothing out there. Nothing. Our best bet for survival is getting as deep into the wilderness as we can and camping out there for good. I never did like camping, May said under her breath. Saya glared at her. Oh, so Saya was going to be protective of Holden now, was that it? May rolled her eyes. Across the fire, she saw lank-haired Sebastian do the same exact eye roll, and felt a moment of unexpected solidarity. Teddy, the stupid football TV star, stood up too, and stretched his beefy shoulders out wide, like he was about to try to put his arm around a girl during a movie. This is all super interesting, and I get that this is real important to everybody, he said. But there's no need to get so worked up about this. If you're looking to me to explain, Inez pulled Teddy down beside her. She wasn't gentle about it. Shut up, Teddy. They aren't looking to you for anything. She stood up and addressed the crowd, not just Holden. I don't like the idea of getting sliced up any more than the rest of you, she said. But I don't like the idea of slowly starving in the forest real well either. We don't have any tools or shelter or anything. And to get our hands on those things, we're going to have to risk getting closer to the caretakers. Unless one of you has a machete and a pop-up tent in your pocket, maybe a little generator in your backpack. She glanced at Loki, but Loki only looked embarrassed. Hiram piped up. Jingwei would know what to do, he said mournfully. Nevaeh shushed him, but kindly. So what are you proposing? Holden had his hands on his hips. He was so mad, he was even standing up straight for once. Inez shrugged. A few of us go back to the train and look for more than just food, she said. There might be a lot of things there that could help us. Even if we do decide to ditch all signs of civilization and live in a hole like a bunch of... She looked at Umta out of the corner of her eye and stopped dead. We know there was food on the train, she said. And water. But maybe we can get more. Pieces we can use as tools, you got me? Seems to me, a few things we can use as knives and pots would go a long way to help, no matter what we do next. That's true. Heads nodded around the circle. Inez steamed right on. If you want to keep moving, then we keep moving. But we'll do it prepared. I'll go back, Loki said. If someone has to be in danger, it'll be me. We wouldn't be here if... 1,000-yard stare on that one. May had heard Saya blaming Loki's itchy trigger finger for wrecking the train, but she wasn't really sure what had happened. She couldn't bring herself to ask Loki directly. May wondered suddenly exactly how he'd died. He'd never said. Sunita flashed her blazing white smile. Sounds like fun, she said. As far as May could tell, the girl thought anything that could get her killed was fun. Sunita blazed on. I'm in. Let's go in the morning. Thanks, Loki said. Means a lot. He darted a glance at Sunita, then looked away before he got caught. Interesting. I will go, Umta added. She was sitting away from the fire, not quite a part of the group in more ways than one. Fine, Holden said. All three of you go and see what else you can bring back. We'll stay here and try to keep a low profile. But he didn't look happy about it. Inez cleared her throat. For tonight, let's have a party, she said. I think we all need to chill and spend some time being grateful we're alive. Hiram pressed his lips together. That's disrespectful to the dead, he said. You think your friends would be mad that you're happy you didn't die too, little man? Inez arched an eyebrow at him. No, but... He trailed off, left with only his indignation. Teddy clapped Inez on the back. Sure, let's imagination up some BBQ and a keg. Why not? His tone was jovial, but there was a tightness around his eyes. Inez jabbed him in the ribs in exchange. Jerk, I'm being serious here. We need to cut loose a little bit. Have some fun. Like a Thanksgiving feast. Stuff ourselves silly on this stupid paste because we're not dead yet. Celebrate everyone you've lost. Like a wake? Cole asked. Nevaeh looked up from her spot by the fire, where she was stirring the vat of gruel with a branch. Some feast. It's not like all of this food is going to keep for very long anyway. We could play a game too, Loki said. He stared into the fire, like he wasn't sure he'd wanted anyone to hear him. What, like charades? Saya snorted. May liked her a little less for it. Why not charades? May said loudly. My family loves charades. And it's not like there's anyone cool here to judge us for it, is there? She looked hard at Saya, who shrank back like she'd been singed. Let's just wait until dinner is ready, Nevaeh said. And then if people feel like it, we can choose an activity. Always fixated on proper meals, like the apocalypse hadn't happened. May wondered sometimes if Nevaeh suffered constant low-level stress from not being able to set a table properly either. A silence fell. Not a real silence. They were in the woods, after all, and from the sound of it, there were thousands of happy crickets nearby, living their dumb little cricket lives without a concern in the world. Inez was right as far as May was concerned. They did need a party. They did need to let go of their tension. But it wasn't going to be possible as long as they were running for their lives. Now. May bit her lip. If she left Gabe there face down in that whirlwind of ice, he'd die for sure. Assuming he wasn't already as good as dead from brain trauma. But how could she possibly save him? He was practically as big as two of her. And if she set foot even a step outside of her shelter, she might be struck by a stray piece of giant hail too, and share his fate. Which would help exactly nobody. That was assuming that she wasn't going to freeze to death right here, or get blown away by a stray gust of wind. She'd seen trees blowing over like blades of grass. One of them must have been 60 feet tall. But Gabe was out there, and she had to choose something. The decision weighed on her. Risk her life for the chance of saving someone else. Not that it was clear either one of them was going to make it through the storm alive. Stay or go? Bravery or prudence? Idealism or pragmatism? Pragmatism. A practical approach to problems. Maybe the weather would calm down if she just waited a minute. 2 minutes. It couldn't keep going like this forever, could it? May! You were going to be a judge. Hard decisions were going to be your life's work. Why can't you just decide? She had to make the decision again every second that she stayed, though. She cowered under her glass shelf, watching and worrying. Even if she didn't go yet, she could go now. No, now. She really shouldn't go. It was too dangerous, too risky. He might already be dead anyway, or seconds away from it. Or she could go now. Then again, sitting there waffling over what to do was making a decision too. Snow was accumulating on Gabe's back, in his hair. If she waited much longer, he'd be completely buried. A piece of ice struck above her head. Crack. The glass pane fractured in a crazed series of lines, a pixelated maze, though the surface remained solid. May shook herself hard, jolted out of her endless loop of indecision, and then she darted out toward Gabe. Ice hit her face, her hands. The snow all around his body was pocked like the moon from sleet, and red from blood. Not his body, May. It's a body if someone is already dead, but until then, it's still... She tried to pick him up entirely, sort of sliding her hip under his back and lifting with her thighs, but she just wasn't strong enough. She grabbed his hand and tried to pull him along behind her through the snow, but her feet slipped, carving 2 icy gulches with no traction. Ice pelted every inch of her exposed skin, stinging like 1,000 angry wasps. She blinked crystals out of her eyes, palmed snowy hair back. She tried again. She couldn't lift him. She couldn't drag him. There had to be another way. Eventually, she stood straddling his torso, her feet on either side of his chest. She bent down and grasped his underarms. She took a deep breath and tried to lift him into a sitting position. He was heavy, boneless, and by the time she had a good grip and a good position, she was almost warm. Steam billowed from her mouth in great clouds mingled with the snow. May bent her knees deep and heaved Gabe forward step by slow, painful step, like she might have thrown a bowling ball underhand. Her biceps screamed from the effort. Hopefully, she wasn't injuring Gabe any further by moving him like this, but surely nothing she was doing to him now could possibly be worse than leaving him out in the cold. Could it? Hail struck her ear, her knee. She saw stars. She kept going. Lift and push and rest. Lift and push and rest. She reached the closest glass panel, not the same as the now broken one she'd been hiding under before. And with one last flat-out effort, she got Gabe under the shelter, where it was warmer and a little less windy. Then she sat crouched beside him for long moments, just breathing. In, out. In, out. There. She had done something. Made a decision. If she was going to die here of hypothermia, thirst, whatever else was coming for them, well, at least now she'd have company. And at least she'd done the right thing. 6 hours earlier. Loki, Sunita, and Umta went out at dawn to see what they could find in the wreckage of the train. That left the rest of their sorry selves to lick their wounds and rest. They didn't exactly have a lot in the way of first aid supplies, but Nevaeh had found a patch of mint leaves nearby, and Cole had tried sticking one of their new bottles in the ashes to see if it would melt. It didn't, so they all had hot mint tea. May cupped hers close to her face. The night had been cooler than any they had ever encountered in their first camp. She'd been grateful for the fire. At least here it wasn't so rainy, though there was a smudge on the horizon that made her suspect that wasn't going to last for much longer. The wait for the scavengers to return was unbearable. Nevaeh helicoptered over the injured, like she thought she could make them better by sheer force of attention. Cole and his healing leg, Inez's cut-up hand and hurt shoulder. A barely there scrape along Sebastian's knee, where he'd stumbled getting off the train. Hiram and Cole were huddled close together, the big one and the little one. Cole had been keeping an eye out for Hiram. Nothing too obvious, but it made May feel relieved that someone was looking out for the baby. She sure didn't want to. Cole and Hiram made for a charming picture together, though. Rustic farm brothers. Come to think of it, they looked like they could be related. Nevaeh fussed over Cole's splint one more time, and then turned her attention to May. "You weren't hurt, right?" she asked, laying her hand between May's shoulders. "Is there anything you need?" May twitched away from Nevaeh's casual touch. "I'm fine," she said. "I don't need anything from you." But come to think of it, there was something May needed, and desperately. She needed to be alone. May had never really considered herself an introvert. She liked people. She liked to be around people. She spent tremendous amounts of time on the phone and in meetings, organizing, studying, checking in, being there. But she'd always done most of her homework alone, where nobody could interrupt her train of thought without her permission. And much of the joy of running had been not the physical exhilaration, but the lightness that stayed once everyone else's expectations were gone. She hadn't been alone, genuinely alone, since the moment she'd woken up on that space station, and Umta had poked her frightening face through the door. Sure, she'd stepped away a few yards to relieve herself, but she'd been too close to these people for too long, and the train had only made it worse. She needed to be away from them. And there was no sense just sitting around doing nothing anyway. There were still practical concerns to attend to. Food, fresh water, maybe better shelter. They hadn't had time for real hunger to set in after stuffing themselves with that train sludge. But it wasn't going to be long in coming. They still needed a plan. May edged over to where Holden and Inez were conducting a silent stare-off of some kind. Listen, I was thinking I would go foraging to see what there is out there. Time's wasting, and we don't know if they'll find anything on the train, May said. The rest might be burned to ashes. Inez waved at May as if in dismissal. Fine. Go with a partner. I'm sure you'll find something. May stiffened. I want to go out by myself, she said. You can't. Holden was adamant. Absolutely not. Buddy system or nothing. You know what happened to Wesley. It's not safe. Nevaeh put a gentle hand on May's arm, and May recoiled again. We've already lost so much, Nevaeh said. We all have to be careful now. We can't lose anyone else. I need to be alone for a while, May said. There was an edge to her voice, and her mother would have known to stand down immediately, but Nevaeh just smiled placidly. You can be alone behind that tree, she said. But if you go any farther than that... Hiram's eagerness to help was almost painful. I'll go with you, May, he said. I've been getting real good at rabbit snares, so if I set up enough, I'm sure I can catch something. Cole stepped in before May had to answer. I don't think that's a good idea, he said. Need you to stay around here and help with the fire, buddy. Not to mention, Inez said, the two of you aren't exactly the heavyweights. Who would be protecting who from predators? Gabe stood up. I'll go with May, he said. Getting restless my own self. May made an inarticulate sound of protest, but nobody seemed to pay her any attention. I want to go out too, said Saya. I can't stand us sitting here. May turned to Holden, expecting him to fall all over himself to go into the woods with his lady love. But Inez stepped in instead. We can team up, she told Saya. Nevaeh can stay here with anyone who doesn't feel up to moving around yet. Teddy nodded politely at Inez. Mind the third wheel, ma'am. Inez shrugged. Don't see how I can stop you. Let's all meet back here at camp by dark, Holden said. He pointed at the mountainside where the train had wrecked. We can navigate by that, right? It should be visible from just about anywhere. All right, that sounds like a good plan, Inez said. May smirked, on the inside, if not the outside, to hear Inez blessing Holden's plan, just like he needed her permission. Just like she was the one running this operation. Before long, Inez was going to be the mayor of this place. Gabe, are you even fit to go out? May asked. It hadn't been that long since his turn as bait for the saber-tooth. How's your balance? He shrugged. Still a little vertigo from time to time, but I've had worse. Should be fine. May bent to touch her toes, stretching out her hamstrings. Fine. Just try to keep up. She snagged a backpack to carry food in, and then loped off into the woods. Gabe could follow her or not. She really didn't care. Their camp was in a heavy forest thick with underbrush, the better to hide from any caretakers that might follow the train tracks. But the forest turned thin and scrubby only a few hundred yards away. The trees were shorter and farther apart, and there were wide patches with nothing growing but short grass or patches of moss. As best May could figure, this was new-growth forest. Maybe there had been a wildfire a few years back. She forged ahead, stopping sometimes to sniff at a leaf or frown at a plant. Before they boarded the plane, she learned to recognize certain kinds of edibles. Here, though, everything was different from the lush overgrowth of that ruined city. The season was different, too. Or maybe it was more accurate to say that here, it really did feel like late fall. None of the trees had fruit on them, for one thing. Here it was definitely autumn. and the trees were blazing gold and red, where they had leaves at all. May quietly worried that the season for every human-edible variety of food might be over already. They did see game from time to time. Squirrels, each with 2 extraordinarily full tails. Something like a Dalmatian the size of a teapot. An honest-to-God turkey gobbling its way along like it had an appointment it was late for. But they didn't exactly have the right tools for hunting. May found a stand of mushrooms under a broad, leafy tree. They were shaped like little bullets, white and speckled with brown freckles. She frowned at them. Poisonous or not? Hiram might know, or maybe Wesley would have, but May sure as heck didn't. She wished for the millionth time that she had a working cell phone. She could just take a picture and send it off for a quick safety check. Or she could do an image search on some mushroom edibility site. Of course, that working cell phone would also mean the presence of a lot of other things that didn't exist in this new reality. Cell service, electricity, malls. A working cell phone would mean she'd never have to be here, staring at a stupid patch of mushrooms, wondering if they were safe to eat or if starving was a better option. She sighed and shoved them into her bag. Let Nevaeh figure it out. She seemed to like that kind of thing anyway. Gabe trailed a dozen yards behind her at a slower pace, picking his way carefully over the rough terrain. He tried to make conversation. What did you want to be when you grew up? I want to be the first Chinese-American justice of the Supreme Court, May announced. Behind her, Gabe choked. That's awful specific. I like specific. What about you? Gabe leaned against a sapling, rubbing his temples. Wasn't sure. Kid like me didn't have a whole lot of options, you know what I mean? Sure, she knew what he meant. And it wasn't worth the argument to her. Have you found anything delicious yet? She asked lightly. You wanted to be on the Supreme Court? For real? He chuckled. I knew you had spark, but come on. That's kind of ridiculous. May shoved a branch aside so savagely that it cracked off the tree. It's not ridiculous. And I could have done it, too. I could have. Back home, some of us were working our tails off for a future that happened without us. You think you're the only one who worked hard? What? You think you're better than the rest of us? He sounded a little more intense than May expected, like he was talking about something besides what she'd wanted to be when she grew up. You're definitely not better than anyone else out here. But you don't know anything about my life, what it was like for me before. All I know is I worked every second of my life, she snapped back. And the only thing I've got to show for it is... She gestured to the backpack she carried, the scratches on her arms from bushes catching her, the stupid red jumpsuit. He shook his head and watched May from under low eyebrows. Why you always gotta be so high-strung? Look, I'm not warm and fuzzy, got it? It's not who I am. She squatted and ran her fingers over a patch of lichen on a flat rock. She scraped at it with a fingernail. The surface below was shiny, metallic. Man-made, perhaps. Or caretaker-made? Gabe caught up with her. He rested a dark hand on her shoulder as he bent to see what had caught her interest. His face was close to hers. His cheeks had a velvet sheen to them, his skin almost glowing in the sun filtering through the trees. But good complexion or not, it was way, way too close. She twitched away and eased back to a more comfortable distance. Stay back. Gabe looked upset, disappointed. Do you think I'd hurt you? Like I'm some thug. He was angry. What right did he have to be angry? But May was angry too. Are you calling me racist? I'm just saying you're behaving in some ways that don't speak well of you. None of that matters anymore, don't you get it? It never should have mattered already, but now... She backed away, farther from his reach. Don't talk to me like I'm a white girl. I was working to try to fix the system. Level the playing field for people who look like me. And yeah, for you too. The solution, Gabe said carefully, was never to change the system from the inside. You can't do that. The Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house. It sounded like a quote, but May couldn't place it. Gabe looked a little disappointed that she didn't pick it up. How would you have fixed it then? She crossed her arms tight. He bent to examine a red berry, smelled it, tossed it onto the ground. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to start over from nothing." He walked away from her to examine a stand of reed-like plants, maybe a kind of wild onion. He wobbled ever so slightly, like he might tip over. She pursed her lips and measured his unsteady progress. "We need to get you a walking stick," she said. It was almost an apology. She surveyed the trees looking for a likely candidate, and found a branch long enough, straight enough, thick enough for the job, hanging dead from a birch tree. She broke off the stick spiraling out from it at the base, until she had something more or less usable. Then she presented it to Gabe. "I'm not a cripple," he said, annoyed. "Can't turn my head too fast or I get a little sick, that's all." "Sure," May agreed. "But you're slowing me down. Just because you need help now doesn't mean you're going to need my help forever. Take it." "Fine," Gabe said. "But don't act like I owe you anything." May tossed her head, the best flounce she'd done since she'd been here. "Just try to keep up." She ran ahead, intentionally leaving Gabe behind. She didn't need a chaperone. She didn't need to babysit anyone. It was all fine. She moved on. There were dozens of acorns scattered on the ground beneath a series of trees. And were those chestnuts? Hazelnuts? Back to that same question of photos and access to knowledge. She hovered over them for a while, trying to psych herself into picking them up and putting them in her bag. Even if she wouldn't dare try them, the others could eat them, and they could use the fat and protein. She was stopped by the memory of her throat swelling shut, her lungs burning with oxygen hunger. She squatted down, rested her fingertips an inch away from one of the nuts. But she couldn't do it. She stood up and kicked at them angrily. A nut ricocheted off the tree trunk and careened into some shrubbery. A twitch came from inside the brush. May froze. Maybe Holden had been right. There could be any number of dangerous things in these forests, the saber-tooths, for instance, or something different and unexpected, something local. When the rabbit bounced out of the shrubbery, its nose twitching, May laughed out loud in relief. The rabbit lowered its chest to the ground, eyes fixed on her. Its floppy ears lay back along its spine. It raised its hindquarters, almost like a cat about to... Oh no. The rabbit smiled, showing its fangs, long and sharp, like no rabbit from the 21st century. And this rabbit was the size of a terrier, easy. May eased away, then tripped and fell onto her back. The rabbit launched itself toward her, teeth first. May flinched, so it latched onto her forearm and not her throat. Its teeth didn't break through her jumpsuit, and another time she'd have been impressed by how sturdy the fabric was, but it held on all the same with dogged ferocity. She batted at it with her free hand, but it didn't let go. She scrabbled in the dirt for something to hit it with. A pebble, some sand. Her hand closed on a stick. She smacked the rabbit with the stick. It let go of her arm and tried to go toward her throat again. She whacked it hard on the top of the skull. The rabbit made a horrible keening sound and bounded away into the shrubbery. May lay on her elbows in the dirt one more long moment. That had been awfully close. Maybe she should have stuck with Gabe after all. Maybe she should go back and find him now. Nah. She'd fended off the rabbit just fine, she decided. And Gabe was so much bigger and stronger than she was, he'd be fine on his own too. He caught up with her a few seconds later anyhow, drawn by the noise. "Are you okay?" He scanned her, looking for signs of injury. May brushed the dirt off her jumpsuit. "I'm fine," she snapped. "Totally fine." Now. Once May had Gabe's body under one of the tables with her, she dragged his limbs around to try to condense him into a ball, so none of his lanky parts stuck out into the snow. The ground beneath them was providing a little warmth, but it wouldn't be enough. Then she took a good look at him. Gabe's skin was paler than usual, and his lips were gray. There was blood matted on the side of his head where the ice had struck him. She poked at it gingerly. The injury didn't seem very deep, and the bleeding had more or less stopped, though she wasn't sure if that was down to clotting or freezing. She tried to remember everything she'd ever learned about first aid. It wasn't much. If Nevaeh were here, she'd know what to do. May hadn't even taken the CPR course at school. It would have looked good to have the certification, but it was scheduled against a series of key track meets, and May couldn't miss those for anything. If Hiram were here, he'd probably know all about first aid in the wilderness, too. He'd know how to build an igloo, and then a fire inside of the igloo. Loki would probably know a body hack he'd seen online to wake Gabe up, using some weird quirk of the nervous system. Cole could have just carried Gabe back to camp. Teddy, too, Mr. Football. Maybe even Holden, for that matter. He wasn't as big as Cole, but he turned out to be a little tougher than he looked. But oh, who was May even kidding? Absolutely none of them would have pulled her jerk move and wound up like this. Only she would get someone into this situation in the first place. And now they were both going to die, and it was going to be her fault. Her fault. She was the one person with nothing to contribute. The one person with no future in the future. May, that's not helping you. And it's not helping Gabe. Deep breaths. Focus. First aid always started with checking the pulse, right? She felt at Gabe's wrist, tentatively, but couldn't find anything. There was another pulse point in the neck, but she couldn't bring herself to put her fingers there. It seemed too personal. Then she noticed the faint cloud of mist coming from his mouth. Breath. He was breathing. So that meant he was definitely still alive. May sagged against the single leg of their shelter in relief. Gabe wasn't dead yet. She sat up again immediately, though. The glass might as well have been made of ice. It was so cold. It was so cold. And now that the excitement was over, well, now that she'd stopped moving around anyway, May's awareness inevitably crept back to cold and frostbite and hypothermia. She shivered. She curled into a ball. Her teeth chattered until they were sore. Her ears were burning, and her fingers. Her nose had already lost sensation. And if she was so cold, then Gabe must be worse. She wished for walls, at least, to stop the wind. Come to think of it, maybe she could do something about that. May didn't want to touch the snow with her hands, though, and she didn't want to get any more wet than she already was. She emptied out her backpack, mushrooms and fragments of leaves scattering to every corner of the shelter. Then she used her backpack to scoop the snow and ice into mounds, protecting herself and Gabe from the worst of the wind. She worked as quickly as she could, and the snow fell fast enough that she never had to reach far for more material. Soon, she'd built walls all the way to the top of the glass sheet. Wind didn't cut through anymore, and the snow, she hoped, would provide some insulation, too. Her guess was right. It started to grow warmer in the enclosed space almost at once. Not exactly room temperature, but enough that she noticed. Probably still dangerously cold. She just hoped she'd be able to tell when the storm was over. May studied Gabe's face, as if she could learn what to do next from it. It was dangerous to let people with a concussion sleep, right? In case they never woke up. A shame, though. He always looked tense to her while he was awake. Now, though, the only remnant of that was a tiny crease between his eyebrows. She shook his shoulder, trying to rouse him. "Gabe? Gabe, wake up!" He opened his eyes and looked straight at her. "Mama?" Then he closed his eyes again. She didn't know a lot about first aid, but she knew one thing. That was really not good. She reached for Gabe's hand. It was freezing, just like hers. She hesitated. There was a solution, a way for both of them to warm up faster. They could share warmth, or they could die apart. Being warm would mean being close, in a way she didn't think she had been with anyone since she was a toddler. She'd never been a huggy child, much to her mother's dismay. But now was not the time to be persnickety about personal space. Now was the time to survive, whatever that required. She shivered even harder at the thought. May heaved Gabe onto his side, and then folded his arms in front of him. Yin. Then she lay curled in front of him, one hand under his arm, one leg between his, nose to nose and breath to breath. Yang. Between them, a bubble of warm air formed. For a long time, this was all she could think about. Breath, warm and slow. the heat where Gabe's body touched hers. She was acutely aware of every heartbeat, every tiny motion. A stray thought came into her head. She'd never had a boyfriend back home. There was no time for that nonsense. She'd seen friends from the 5th and 6th grades lose their minds and their academic edge when their hormones came in. She hadn't been friends with them for much longer after that. She was meant for greater things than giggling over who texted whom and how late at night. So much for greater things. But maybe she could keep Gabe alive until the storm passed. Maybe he could keep her alive, too. Time passed. Hours, maybe days. May had no way to tell. She thought about the precious calendar she'd left behind at camp. The one thing she'd brought with her onto the train when all hell broke loose. Now she didn't even have that one stupid thing anymore. All she had were heartbeats, breaths, time. The wind still howled, the ice still fell. Outside the little igloo, snow piled up above and around them. What little light there had been was extinguished. Thanks to May's insulating walls, the space under the table grew warmer and warmer still. And eventually, despite all hope and her expectation of the contrary, May fell asleep. The SAT was about to begin. May slid into her seat silently. All around her, the other students did the same. She knew their names, but she couldn't see their faces. They spoke to one another, but she couldn't hear their voices. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. It didn't matter. She was here for the SAT, and she was ready to kick its ass. The first big step on her way to being the first Chinese-American Supreme Court Justice. She tapped her Batsmadu pencil on her desk impatiently. The school chair May sat in was uncomfortable. She felt her bones pressing hard into its surface. She'd lost too much weight. Why had she... And why was it so cold? No time for introspection. Focus. The faceless teacher placed the test packet and answer sheet in front of May, then swept past like a ghost. The other students bent their heads and began to scribble answers into their bubbles in perfect synchrony. Time for May to shine. She opened the booklet to the first page. This was the verbal part of the SAT. She was no slouch when it came to mathematics. She'd had a good run in mathletes in middle school before she'd settled on a career plan in law instead of engineering, and decided to spend her time on more precisely targeted activities. But verbal was a piece of cake. This was going to be spectacular. She carefully put down her name on the sheet and turned her attention to the first question. Multiple choice vocabulary. See a word, choose the correct meaning. The first word was intransigent. Perfect. That had been on her lists. She could almost see it. So was the answer A, a kind of monkey, B, having insufficient money, C, beautiful, or D, having little emotion? Wait, that wasn't right, was it? None of them were. May pressed her eraser under her nose. She should know that one. Why didn't she know that one? The scratching of the other students' pencils around her began to grate on her nerves. They kept marking answers straight down the line, as if they already knew them. Like they didn't even have to read the questions. May looked up at the clock above the smartboard. Time was almost up, and she hadn't marked any answers yet. She scanned down the page in the test booklet, looking for the easier questions. There had to be easy ones, at least for her, after all of her studying. All of the practice tests. She'd been acing them for months. And it's not like she was stupid. She was not stupid. She had this. This was what she was better at than anybody. Even if half the words on the page looked like a random jumble of letters someone had put down as a joke. Forge onward, May. Work harder. She settled on another question. Pusillanimous. This one wasn't multiple choice. There was space for a paragraph where she was meant to write out the definition using her own words. Okay, she had this. She did. It was also from her study sheets, even if this was one of the words she struggled to remember. But she keenly remembered treating herself to a handful of gummy worms when she got it right on a practice test. Pusillanimous, meaning... She blanked. What did it mean? Was it even a real word? The other students all stood up and began to file to the front of the classroom to turn in their test sheets. May's hands began to shake. She had this. She could do it. She just had to answer a question, any question, and it would be fine. She stared at the booklet. What was wrong with her? Why couldn't she remember any of the vocabulary words at all? What does pusillanimous mean? It means cowardly, came Gabe's voice, purring close to her ear. May snapped awake. 1 hour earlier. May, you can't keep shaking me like this. We should stick closer together, Gabe said. That rabbit has a family, and I bet there's something else around here that eats rabbits. He limped along grimly, his knee clearly hurting him with every step, but he didn't make a breath of sound. May didn't respond. Instead, she darted ahead, frustrated at the slow pace, then fell back, tied to Gabe's side by a tether of abrasive obligation. Slow down, Gabe called. Why did you even come with me if you can hardly keep up? May flared. Gabe froze. I thought... His voice was soft. Well, I thought I might like to get to know you a little better. What is that supposed to mean? She was more shrill than she would have liked. Gabe shrugged with one shoulder. Is it so terrible that I might want to spend some time with you? He looked at her, steady and sure, but she wouldn't meet his eye. Just try to stay with me. May flashed ahead again and found the end of the forest. For a long time, they'd been zigzagging through the scrubby forest, where it felt more likely that they'd find food. Always keeping an eye on that mountain they left behind, of course, though there was no spotting the train wreck at its foot from this far away. Finally, they ran out of forest to explore. The trees thinned and then petered out entirely, and shrubbery gave over to tall grass like a whispering carpet. No more forest. Instead, they emerged into a vast, rolling plain, sweeping toward the horizon. The grass heads bobbed, drowsy with seeds. May wondered if those seeds were edible. A kind of wheat, or another grain. She wondered who would be able to tell. Cole would know wheat, she thought. And maybe Nevaeh, too. She plucked a few to show to the others at camp. The sky was low here, big and filled with cumulus clouds. Or nimbus? The dark ones, fat and full of rain. Definitely not cirrus. Those were the wispy ones. May's jaw and fists clenched tight. Every day she was here, hard-won knowledge slipped out of her brain, replaced by hunger, fear, loss. Then something caught her eye. A bright gleam on the far side of the valley. Wait, what's that up there? May asked. Can you think of anything in nature that shines like that? She shielded her eyes to get a better look, but it didn't help much. Metal, maybe? Or glass, like windows. It has to be something man-made, or artificial anyway. Or, she thought, it could be water. She stopped herself before blurting it out. This could be her chance to finally get a little precious alone time. Might be dangerous, Gabe said. We should steer clear. If we're camped this close to something dangerous, we need to find out what it is and tell the others, May said breezily. She swung her arms up and out, limbering her muscles. I'll race you there, she said. Gabe winced, and May flushed to see it. Guilt fell heavy on her. That had been unkind, beneath her. Come on, May, don't be like that, he said. There could be caretakers anywhere, especially somewhere artificial. May studied the gleam instead of Gabe. It was a lot easier. Yeah, probably just water. But we should really find out what that is, she said. She flexed her shoulders, stretched her quads. I'll check it out, and you stay here. Time to really sell it. She nodded sharply once. This way, if I don't come back, you can warn the others. I'm faster than you, so I have a better chance of getting away if it is something bad. What? May, don't. May didn't hear the rest of it, because she was already gone. The grass scratched her face and hands at first, caught at her clothes. But farther out, the grass was shorter, and the going a little easier, so she could loose all the speed that had been building up inside her over the last few weeks. She could be herself. She could let go of expectation and just be. Everything fell away, lost to the fierce pumping of her heart, the steady flex of her thighs. The rhythm soothed her. Her stride was short at first, tense, but the longer she ran, the looser she became. She could go yards in a stride, miles. This was the first time May had been alone, really blessedly alone and free, since the moment she'd woken up on that space station, and the course of her life had changed irrevocably. May was still set on revoking that change anyway, however she could. Even if it meant living a life that wasn't the one she'd planned, if she could just see her mom and dad again. This time she'd play that board game. This time she'd eat dinner with the family. She raced to leave her regrets behind. This freedom was a welcome change. It had been a long time since she'd been able to run full tilt. Not since she died. There was no point in dancing around it. That cold, hard place inside her began to dissolve, step by step. She found a narrow trail through the grass, made by murder deer or vorpal bunnies, or whatever aberration of the animal kingdom lived around here. Scissor frogs for all May knew. Come to think of it, she hadn't seen any animals at all since she'd left the trees. Not even a mouse. Not that mice were the easiest to spot. Not a bird. The sky grumbled like it missed the birds too. May pushed it all aside, focusing on her feet hitting the ground, her breath in and out. She could tell she was slower than she should be, and tiring too fast. Not enough exercise. Or maybe just plain not enough food. Her jumpsuit had grown baggy around the middle. It chafed and twisted. The scissor frog trail, or whatever, was free of grass. But it was still different from the smooth, paved trail she was used to, and that slowed her down eventually. She stumbled over tiny hillocks and holes. She fell to a jog, then a walk. Just as well. She was coming close to the glint on the horizon, so she needed to be more careful. The glint was rapidly resolving into an actual object. Or, to be more precise, a series of them. May found herself on the edge of an endless field of structures, each roughly the size and shape of her parents' dining room table. They seemed to be made of bluish glass. Each had one leg in the center, rather than four at the corners, and there were rows upon rows of them, standing in neat, endless lines, like saplings in a Christmas tree farm May had seen once along the highway. The grass grew up around the structures, seeming to ebb and flow like ocean tides on the stiff breeze. When she looked more closely, she could see that a few of the glass tables were missing. Some had cracks in them, or dark spaces gaping where something had left a hole. She wondered if this place was as old as the ruins they'd left behind. She sat down in the grass a safe distance away, looking and listening for any sign of danger. Were these glass sheets caretakers in another shape, or things that could communicate with the caretakers? She heard a low hum, or thought she did, like something electrical running in the distance. Nothing moved. Not a rabbit, not a bird. Just the grass, twirling in the wind. That stiff breeze had picked up quite a bit, and gales were plucking at her hair, stuffing it into her eyes and mouth. Oh, what she would give to have a proper ponytail holder. And funny, she thought, how she always knew she'd suffer without food, without water. But she'd never given enough thought to hair ties, clean laundry, toilet paper. Inevitably, as she watched the glass farm for signs of danger, she got to thinking. She was always thinking, to be sure, but mostly she tried to stay fixed on more practical concerns. Who was going to stay awake to keep watch over the others at night? Whether there was enough firewood, and who was going to get more if there wasn't? Whether the soup was safe to eat? How to tie the knots in a hammock so they didn't feel like a bunch of rocks pressing into your spine all night. Jingwei had taught her how to do that last one. The thought struck her in the gut like a wrecking ball. Jingwei was gone. Dead twice. And the others too, torn apart like cheap toys. Gone. And finally, no matter how hard May tried, the weight of everything she had lost crashed down on her. Not just the SAT. Not just her blazing future as the first Chinese-American Supreme Court justice. No. Everything else was gone too. If Wesley had been right, and they were in the future, that meant the world had gone on spinning without her. Her friends had already lived their full lives and died. Who'd taken over Model UN or the debate team? Who'd won the race to be valedictorian? What colleges had everyone been accepted to, and then gone to? What degrees? What jobs? Had they gotten married? To whom? Did they have families? Her mom and dad had kept on living too. She wondered if they'd stayed married.
She wondered if they'd had any other children.
To replace her. She wondered if she'd had a funeral, and what it was like. Who came? Who cried? She found herself hating all her old friends for the extra 60 years or more they'd had. 60 more years of not starving. 60 years of air conditioning when it was hot, and heat when it wasn't. 60 years of solid roofs that actually kept the rain out, and the bugs. 60 years of not running for their lives from murderous robots on the one hand, and the equally murderous Mother Nature on the other. She wondered if anyone had still missed her even a year later. May lay flat in the dirt, hidden by the grass, and cried for a while. Heaving, choking sobs, mourning herself, her old friends, her new ones, even humanity, which seemed to be over and gone. She would have given everything to get home again. Everything. But what if it wasn't even possible? The weather changed all at once. It grew dark. The shadow of the clouds swallowed her up. The temperature plummeted. She thought at first she was imagining it, until ferns of frost began appearing on those glass tables. It shocked her, how quickly they uncurled across the panes. It was like something from a movie, sped up 1,000 times. Then the snow began to fall, or hail, or whatever it was. Just lazy flakes at first, soft in May's hair. A few chips of ice hit her, biting into her face like nails falling from the sky. She looked back to see how far she was from the tree line. It was farther than she'd thought. She'd run faster or longer than she would have thought possible, starvation or not. But shelter was close by, those sheets of glass. She hesitated. A piece of hail struck her in the shoulder and drove her into action. She jogged toward the farm of tables, then ducked under one for shelter. It was warmer beneath the glass, as if there were a heat source under her feet. She huddled low to the ground and watched the snow pile up. Now. Light filtered dim and blue through the top of the table, as if through an aquarium, leaving May with a distinct impression that she was underwater. She wondered, briefly, if there was any mythology around cold water mermaids, then set it aside as a pointless distraction. She had more important things to worry about. For one thing, there was the question of Gabe, with his forehead on her collarbone and his arms around her waist. His breath was still going steady and warm. If that unexpected show of vocabulary had been real, and not just a part of her dream, he seemed to have lost consciousness again since then. Or maybe he'd been out the whole time. She disentangled herself in a hurry, and tried to take an assessment of where they were, and what she should do about it now. She did not think about how she might have felt about how close they had been curled together. No time for that. Bigger fish to fry. As she'd slept, their shelter had been completely buried in the snow, and the air inside had become, not comfortable exactly, but tolerable, if oppressively humid. The ground beneath was damp now, but still faintly warm, as if it were alive. Gabe stirred and opened his eyes. His pupils were enormous. "What was that?" "Oh, you're awake. Good. I think that's good. How do you feel? How's your head?" Gabe groaned and curled into a ball with his hands on his head. "Oh, got it." She bit her lip. What did you do for a concussion? Should she be icing his head? Or would that make everything worse on the hypothermia front? She had to get him to the others. But she had barely been able to drag him 12 yards to shelter, and the new camp was miles away. As long as Gabe wasn't walking under his own power, he was stuck here. If she left him alone, she couldn't protect him, or keep him warm. But if she stayed here with him, she couldn't guarantee he'd get better. And the others? They might not even be waiting around for May and Gabe, just in case something worse than the storm had delayed them. There was only one chance. Since Gabe couldn't possibly make it far enough to meet the others, she was going to have to bring the others to him. She set tentative fingertips on his shoulder. "I'm going for help, okay? I'll bring people back for you. I'm not ditching you." His fingers closed around hers, though he still didn't open his eyes. "You wouldn't ditch me." "I'll be fast." She squeezed his hand, quick, and then tunneled an exit out of their shelter and into the light. It was slow going. The snow was packed so tight that she couldn't just push it up and away. Instead, she dug with her backpack again, shoving mounds across the ground to the far side of the shelter, hoping she'd break out into the open before running out of space. Finally, she reached a crust of ice and smashed through it. The first blast of dry, cold air made her cough. Outside, the world was blindingly cold and white. The grass had flattened under the weight of ice and lay buried under a pocked sheet like frosting. In the distance, the forest had grown thicker and unfamiliar. There was no more wind to cut through her jumpsuit, thankfully, and though it was still terribly cold, the worst of it seemed to have already passed. She climbed carefully out of the shelter, expecting to sink. She'd have to plow through a mile of snow like an icebreaker ship. Her feet didn't break through the crust, though. She skidded along the surface and fell, hurt, onto her butt. The snowfall had iced solid on top. May worried she wouldn't be able to find her way back to the right table without a trail to lead her there. She stared at her surroundings, trying to memorize every detail. There was a pine tree knocked over by the storm. And over there was a tree forked into splinters where the branches had fallen away. She turned around and tried to sweep the snow off the top of their table. At least they'd know which was the right one. But the snow was too heavy, and her arms were already tired from digging herself free. After a moment's pause, she ducked her head back into the burrow. "Hand me your walking stick?" For a moment, she thought he'd gone unresponsive again, but then Gabe passed it out to her without comment. She tied her backpack to one end, then drove the other into the hill of the snow on top of Gabe's hiding spot. That should work. She peeked into the shelter one last time. She could barely make out his face in the filtered light that came in through the entrance. "Sit tight," she said. "We'll be back for you before you know it."
"May,"
Gabe said.
"Be careful out there."
May flashed her best, most practiced smile.
The "don't worry, I have a plan" smile. "You won't even know I'm gone," she said. And then May did the one thing she was best at in this new world. She ran. She went tentatively at first, step by step, worried about slipping and breaking her neck. No good to Gabe, no good to herself. Everyone would die. Though she was almost getting used to that idea by now. It had lost its raw animal terror, and now it was just a knot tied tight in her throat. The surface of the snow had been blown smooth by the wind, though, and she still didn't break through. Those slippers the caretakers had given her were warm enough, springy enough, but they had very little grip on the bottom. May took a couple of wild spills before she worked out how to move forward safely. And then, instead of running, she was skating. She kept her weight low and forward and slid from foot to foot. It was faster than running would have been. She slowed as she entered the forest, and fear struck her. What if she got lost? What if she was already lost? Everything looked strange in a blanket of snow. But she could still see the mountainside where the train had crashed, and she made steady progress. The setting sun, she thought it was setting, lent a peach cast to the ice, as if she were in a fairy tale. She was going to have to hurry to get back to Gabe before full dark. And it got so dark out here. She'd never realized before just how dark true darkness was, without the ubiquitous glow of streetlights, headlights, cheery windows. She pushed herself even faster. May worried endlessly as she rushed full tilt toward camp that the others might not be there anymore. Or they might be there, but they might be dead from the snowstorm. It wasn't like they had any better access to heat and shelter than she and Gabe had had. She didn't have long to worry. She didn't even make it all the way back to camp. A voice echoed through the trees. "May? Gabe? Can you hear us? May? Gabe?" It was Holden. The cherry glow of a fire showed her where they were, and then she could see dark shadows moving in front of the light, And she knew that the others were still alive after all. Or at least, some of them. She veered toward them. "Here! I'm here!" She'd expected to rush into camp, but instead she found Holden, Saya, and Sebastian, all three holding flaming branches. They had something like dark robes around their shoulders. Were those blankets? Saya ran to hug May the second she spotted her, and for once, May found she didn't mind. May! We thought you were goners in the storm. Where's Gabe?" "He's hurt," May said. She told them just the quick highlights. The field of glass tables, Gabe's injury, her race for help. Well, most of the story. She didn't tell them about how she'd kept running off. She didn't tell them how she'd been fighting with Gabe all day. She didn't tell them about the SATs. She most certainly didn't tell them about lying close together for heat, breath to breath, and falling asleep that way. She held her hands out to one of their makeshift torches as she spoke, as close as she could bear. But her fingers warming up hurt more than freezing them had. "We have to hurry," she finished. "We need someone who can carry him back here, or a way to warm him up there. I'm not picky." Holden pressed his lips together. "We'll need more supplies," he said. "Let's get you to camp." "We have to hurry," May insisted. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't panicking. She was just trying to impress urgency upon them. "We will," Holden promised. Camp wasn't far. Apparently, Holden's search party hadn't been out long. They'd agreed there was no sense in venturing out until the storm was over, and unlike May, they hadn't been rushing. The rest of the teens, it seemed, had survived the storm unscathed. They were seated around a roaring bonfire, clad in... They were blankets. Where had they come from? And someone had rigged those metal sheets from the train rack into tents, leaning against the trees, buried now in a thick layer of ice. Ah, the train. The expedition to the train must have been wildly successful then. "We need to go get Gabe," Holden announced. "But I need some strong arms. We might need to carry him back here. He's injured." "Who's with me?" Loki stood up. "I'll go," he said. "Least I can do." Holden lit another branch and handed it to Loki. "Great. Maybe we can start a fire there if he can't be moved." Loki took it from him with a slow nod. "Thanks, man." May bit her lip, then headed toward Nevaeh. "Will you come? You know more about medicine than any of us, and Gabe needs it. Please, can you come?" "Stop running at the mouth, May." "Of course I'll come." Nevaeh hesitated. "Are you okay to show us the way there?" She took one of May's hands in hers. "You're still so cold." "I have to show you," May said. "I'll be all right." She didn't pull her hand away, though. "At least take a blanket." Nevaeh took one from the pile and wrapped it around May's shoulders. It was warm, and much softer than it looked. Softer than chenille. May bent her head. "Thanks." Nevaeh grabbed a backpack and began stuffing it with supplies. Blankets, kindling. It was only a few moments' delay, but to May, it felt like forever. As soon as Nevaeh closed the bag and hoisted it onto her shoulder, May took off like a shot. The trip back went fast, though May had to keep reining in her speed so Loki, Holden, and Nevaeh could keep up. They were slower than she was. Everyone was slower than she was. And they didn't have her endurance either, so the three of them slowed more and more. The day faded into deepening twilight. May fretted about getting lost without a clear trail to follow, but she moved with the sun always behind her, hoping she'd get close enough to know the way before full dark. She only had to find the glass tables to find Gabe, and the glass should be visible from pretty far away, once they were clear of the forest. Finally, they burst out of the trees and onto the rolling plains. The rows of tables were just a series of indistinct mounds, casting long shadows across the plain. May scanned them to try to find the right one. The splash of color from her makeshift flag leapt out at her as clearly as if it were a flashing neon sign. "There!" she cried, pointing, and raced forward. By the time they reached Gabe, full dark had fallen. The sky was brilliant with stars. "Gabe, I brought them back for you." She tried to see into the snow cave, but it was too dark to make out more than an indistinct heap. At least I could do that much. There was a faint gleam as the dying sun reflected from Gabe's teeth.
Didn't doubt you for a second,
he said.
May, it's not.
The others caught up. Nevaeh brushed May aside and crawled headfirst into the burrow. Are you okay? She asked. Gabe's voice rumbled back, indistinct. Holden followed after her. Loki squatted in the entryway with a smoldering stick, shutting May out of the first aid proceedings. Instead, May climbed on top of the table to retrieve her backpack and the walking stick. She paused a moment to look up at the stars and admire the view from up here, freezing ears or not. And then she saw it. There was a smear of light on the horizon, brighter than the stars, bright as the moon, bright as electricity. A city. She didn't know how far away it was. 10 miles? 100? Who could tell? But somewhere off to the north, the lights were on. And where there were lights, there might be people too. Maybe, May thought, she had given up hope a few hours too soon.
Remade is a Realm original production. You're listening to Remade Season 1 by Andrea Phillips. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Listen away. Remade is a Realm original production, created by Matthew Cody and written by Matthew Cody, Andrea Phillips, Carrie Harris, E.C. Myers, Kiersten White, and Gwenda Bond. Produced by Lydia Shama, and executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Starring Greg Tremblay and Laurel Schroeder. Audio directed, produced, and sound designed by Amanda Rose Smith. Additional editing by Corey Barton. Original theme composed by Amanda Rose Smith. Cover art by Liz Castle. Find more shows like Remade by following Realm on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or at realm.fm.